Talk about a panel that does not need an introduction. Donna Anderson is the head of global corporate governance for T Rowe Price. Amy Borrus is the executive director for the Council of Institutional Investors. And Michelle Edkins is the managing director of BlackRock's investment stewardship team. Those are some heavy hitters. I'm Brock Romanek. So Michelle, Amy, Donna, thank you so much for doing this during such a busy proxy season. I know how busy your lives are during this 3 to 4 to 12-month period. So the first question is for Michelle. We're going to start talking about environmental sustainability, and the annual letter from your CEO just came out, and congratulations on BlackRock being named in the most admired companies by Forbes. I just saw that a couple of days ago, and that's awesome. But can you talk to the Larry Fink letter a little bit and BlackRock's efforts in the E area?
Sure. So it might help if I just go back to 2020, because that was really the foundation for the 2021 letter. And so last year, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink wrote in his annual letter to CEOs that BlackRock sees sustainability risk, and particularly climate risk, as investment risk. And that we saw this leading to a fundamental reshaping of finance as climate risk and tools to price climate risk just became more commonly in use and were more widely understood. And the letter comes out in January, so that happened before COVID really impacted here in the US. And there was a lot of chatter at the time that the lockdown started in the US that all this focus on sustainability and climate risk and environmental issues would fall away because of the COVID crisis. And actually what we experienced through the entirety of 2020 to today is it really accelerated change. The pandemic made more actors realize the shock impact of systemic risk, the potential for it to really impact across the market. And that, again, a growing realization that climate risk is not dissimilar to the pandemic and the impact that it can have on people as individuals and society and economies at large. So those are the key points that are really echoed or drawn out in the 2021 letter that came out a couple of weeks ago. I'll focus on the stewardship component. There's a component that covers BlackRock as a corporation and what BlackRock is doing in terms of investment options for our clients. But in terms of our stewardship ask, we are saying that we expect companies to publish a plan that explains how they're aligning their long-term business model, their long-term strategy with limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or lower. So the parameters in the Paris Agreement, which is consistent with achieving a global aspiration of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In our stewardship documents, to sort of amplify the message in Larry's letter, we are saying that what that means is companies have to set near-term targets, medium-term targets, and long-term targets as to how they're going to achieve these ambitions, simply because a lot of what we've seen in disclosure to date is a lot of kicking the can down the road. And clearly, there's a lot of action that companies need to take and others need to take based on the information that companies publish. And so we need to see an acceleration in the availability of that information. On a related point, before I hand back to you, Brock, we have drawn out in this letter the importance that companies have clearly placed on having strong relationships with all their stakeholders. And again, how valuable having a clearly articulated purpose was as companies were taking existential decisions in sort of rather ambiguous conditions through the response to and the recovery from the pandemic. And we just see that stakeholder awareness being a critical part of companies' business decision making in the coming year and beyond.
So how is BlackRock kicking the tires, analyzing the soundness and sincerity of a company's environmental efforts. I imagine the stewardship team is going beyond proxy disclosure to look at the sustainability reports.
Yeah, I think rather than sincerity, I talk about comprehensiveness. I think companies can make sincere efforts, but not actually deliver what's needed. And we are using the framework provided by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures to really sense the comprehensiveness of a company's reporting. We're also very clear that we're all on a journey here, whether you're an investor or a company or a regulator or a policy setter in some other form. We're all on a pretty steep learning curve as it comes down to what net zero looks like, what a good net zero aligned business plan looks like. There are a lot of tools being developed, but as people say, we're trying to fly the plane and build it at the same time. And we've got to be a little humble about where we are on that journey. But we are working at BlackRock to develop tools such as Aladdin Climate, I beg your pardon, which is bringing climate tools into risk management and investment management, decision platforms, data platforms. Those kind of tools are going to help us assess both what companies are reporting and how well our clients' portfolios are sort of adapting to a low carbon economy.
And from what I hear, that shareholder engagement over this proxy season has mostly been in the E&S area. And so I'm sure you're asking a lot of questions beyond what you're reading.
Well, exactly. Although I would say we still lead with governance in most of our conversations because we firmly believe that as much as sustainability risk, climate risk is investment risk and long-term planning and setting purpose, those are all responsibilities within the boardroom and the senior executive leadership. And without good governance structures, it's difficult to see how all of the other operational and long-term planning decisions will get enacted. So we always start with the governance, but yes, absolutely, the environmental and social considerations are a core part of the conversation.
So Donna, what about the social? Can you talk for a moment about particularly diversity and inclusion, how T Rowe Price has approached that this proxy season?
Yeah, and I'm going to try to be zippy about it. I'm going to give you 4 ways that we really try to get under the hood when it comes to companies' approach to diversity and inclusion, and then 3 insights that we drew from one of those methods this year. So the 4 ways that we really incorporate the S issues, I would say, in our investment process is, first of all, we're still all active management here at T Rowe Price. And so studying companies, writing about companies, visiting companies, we have full-time analysts, a global team of them that do nothing but that. They cover a small number of companies each. And I think companies would be surprised how much we are writing about and assessing company culture. So that's kind of one. All of that goes into our centralized, research library that then populates a lot of other systems. Second is our quantitative ESG screen that we've built. It's the not very imaginatively named Responsible Investment Indicator Model, RIM. So it does have an E and an S section, and in the S section in particular, a lot of human capital management issues, including diversity, any information we can find about the diversity of the management team, the diversity of the board, just indicators like the HRC index and things like that we found to be, pretty good indicators of culture and inclusion. And that data set is not great today, but is actually getting better at a pretty good pace. The third way is our voting policy. For several years now, we have had a core part of our voting policy for developed markets is to vote against key board leaders at companies where there is no evidence of board diversity traditionally defined. And so we get watch lists and things like that that way being screened out from our voting policy. And then the fourth way, of course, is through engagement. I mean, we talked to hundreds of companies last year, almost all of them about their human capital management issues, and D&I in particular was such a moment in time, where everyone was so focused on their efforts and whether they were good enough. And I sort of started mentally kind of classifying companies in a continuum. Because we saw a lot of, range of responses to employee concerns and board concerns about diversity and inclusion in companies. And so you had everything from, we wrote a check, or our CEO wrote a really emotional, post on LinkedIn, which is appropriate in some circumstances, but, I would put kind of at the lighter end of the spectrum. And kind of in the middle, a number of companies who established, for instance, like Black Leadership Council, or really enhanced their BRGs, or established a series of internal conversations that's still ongoing that they have found to be, meaningful, sort of internally focused efforts like that, to identify ways that they can really make improvements. And at the other end of the spectrum, I would put companies that are actually building businesses around some of these concerns. So for instance, companies who already serve small businesses, they've really, put a real emphasis on, businesses owned or supply chain partners owned by women or minorities, underrepresented groups. So, and then incubators was another idea we heard from some companies I thought was a great one. In our community, we're establishing incubators specifically designed to, encourage and foster entrepreneurship in underrepresented communities. So, three kind of insights that I drew from our engagements in 2020, aside from just all those observations that we gained from companies on a company specific level. One is, I was really happy actually with my overall impression was companies are much more skilled, much more comfortable, and just much more open about talking about real diversity and inclusion issues. I was the president of the T Rowe Price Women's Business Resource Group years ago. So I've been involved in this community for a long time, and I can tell you, 5 years ago when I was doing that, there were so many companies that just couldn't put the words together, and that's really changed. That ice is broken. Second is we all need to be prepared to see a number of companies' diversity metrics will actually go down this year, and that is because we have some, COVID has caused some really just industry-wide impacts. There are some companies that are really troubled, just really facing some pretty tough circumstances, and everybody knows it, right? So all of their best diverse talent is being picked off by companies outside the industry who, make the case that, do you really want to cast your fortunes with that industry, for the long term? So there's going to be some real dislocation, I think, in a lot of those companies. And then third is a pretty interesting dynamic, I think, setting up with work from home, right? So as companies have gotten more comfortable with remote working, a lot of them mentioned to us that they want to use this opportunity to extend the pipelines of talent and where they find them, right? You don't need to hire somebody who's from your zip code. Maybe we can, be more flexible about the pools that we tap into. But I think that's setting up for some trouble long-term in inclusion, right? You can expand your diversity pools and hire, key people and have them sitting all over the world, but then inclusion, becomes a problem because it's already isolating enough. And how are you really going to kind of have that diversity really, get steeped into the company culture? So I think that's going to be a long-term challenge. Was that zippy enough, Brock?
That's very zippy. Do you find, since this is such a fast-moving thing right now, that sometimes you have an engagement and you might even give them ideas, or they get ideas that they're working on, and they come back to you a few weeks later, maybe a month later, and say, hey, in addition to what we talked about, we've now decided to do this and that? Is that too much because there's so many companies you're engaging with for them to do?
I would say the one area that is definitely happening is board diversity, right? So to the extent you can even find a developed market company with a board that completely lacks diversity now, they are on it. I mean, they really are working hard on that, and there might be some searches that have been in progress for a while. All the other stuff, all the internal stuff, really addressing these cultural issues, that takes a long time. So we're in the very early stages of that conversation.
Yeah, I'll comment on something Donna said. A couple of things. You mentioned that companies are picking off key talent, diverse talent, and I think one of the hottest job titles or most in demand is, the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. And we have been putting together a panel of on this topic for our virtual spring conference of folks who can talk about what companies are doing or what companies have learned from their experience and what they're doing differently. And, folks we invited, they just changed companies left, right, and center, over the past 4 months or so. So it's a very hot area right now. So I think you're right. And I think the inclusion point that you made is really interesting. It's one thing, a lot of companies do, like to tout their recruitment efforts, but making people feel like they belong and there's a future is tougher. And it just is. And I think that even without COVID, that's something a lot of companies are struggling with, or looking again at what are we doing, and is there some better way of doing this? And I think the pandemic and work from home has just make it more difficult to tackle that.
So, Amy, I know that CII has been out front about virtual annual meetings for quite some time. And then last year, with the pandemic, virtual meetings exploded. And there's been a number of concerns raised, particularly about the Q&A session, but in general. So how are you feeling about the upcoming meetings? I know you've been on a number of panels with people that are in this space.
I'm feeling more encouraged. And I think that's, for two reasons. First of all, just remember, almost a year ago, it was all of a sudden that companies found, oh my gosh, we can't meet in person. We have to get a platform. There was a rush to do it at the last minute. And first of all, Broadridge, which really owned the business until then, didn't have bandwidth for everybody, and folks were using new providers, and, things got dropped or problems weren't foreseen. So I think it's got to be better this year. And also for two reasons. There were the proxy industry and issuers and investors came together in two working groups to sort of tackle some of the key two big baskets of problems that cropped up. And one was the roadblocks to entering certain virtual shareholder meetings. In some instances, beneficial owners faced extra steps to enter virtual meetings hosted by a provider other than Broadridge. And that was because the control number they received from their broker didn't align with that of a virtual shareholder meeting provider. To gain admission, you had to, as a validated shareholder, you had to obtain a legal proxy from your broker or broker's agent. This was a surprise to some and a time-consuming process, and it meant that effectively some shareholders were shut out of meetings they wanted to attend. So an industry working group, co-chaired by Darla Stuckey of the Society for Corporate Governance and me, tackled this problem in multiple meetings, and actually just this week worked out a technical solution that we believe will be in place for virtual meetings as of March 1st. It was just announced last night and shared with some folks at CorpFin. It involves a technical solution that use of application programming interfaces. We don't have to go there, but it means that it should ensure that beneficial owners with a Broadridge control number can easily enter and vote at a virtual shareholder meeting hosted by another provider and vice versa. Now, companies aren't required to use this API solution, which may entail extra cost. And so investors who think they might want to attend a virtual annual meeting should check the proxy statement carefully for instructions on meeting attendance, because they may find they do have to obtain a legal proxy, and in which case you've got plenty of time to do that now, just in case you want to attend that meeting. So that's, I think that'll help. It's not necessarily a long-term solution. We'll see how it works this proxy season, and if there are complaints or whatever, if there are hiccups, we'll revisit after. But the second basket of problems that investors encountered, you referred to, was really had to do with asking questions and making sure your questions were answered. Was the company cherry picking questions? Did shareholder proposal proponents get to present their proposals in their own voice, things like that? And there's some, mostly this worked out pretty well. I think for the most part, it worked out well. And some of our members were actually pleasantly surprised. They got to attend more meetings than they ever could before, because they could do it from the comfort of their home or desk, whatever. But there were some glitches. And again, another working group of investors and companies formed. Donna, thank you, was a participant in that. And it was very mixed, folks with different interests. And it did result in the report that you referred to that came out, that was published by Rutgers Law School, that provided sort of standard baseline, I wouldn't call them best practices, but standard expectations. And it's a roadmap for companies on, and the most important thing for companies is to really provide clear instructions on, how you get in, how you ask a question, how the company will handle questions, and to provide a lot of tech support and to work with proponents to make sure they get in, can present, and then can join the Q&A part. Because what happened at some meetings was shareholder proponents presented their proposal and then they were shut out of the rest of the meeting. I think everybody learned something, and I think it has to go better this year. It may not be perfect in every case, but I'm pretty sure it'll be a lot better than it was last year.
So thank you so much, Donna, Michelle, and Amy. That was fantastic. I know it's so busy time of year, and so you won't be going back to watch TV. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.